The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll discuss the new state of play on Parliament Hill, then a look at how artificial intelligence is affecting migration. That's all ahead on the agenda. After two shocking by-election losses, the NDP terminating its supply and confidence agreement, and the Conservatives preparing to table a motion of non-confidence, what does the year ahead look like for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberals? Let's ask. Andrew Perez, principal at Perez Strategies and a former special assistant to Premier Kathleen Wynne. Ginny Roth, partner at Crestview Strategy and former organizer for the Ontario PC Party. And in the National Capital Region, Brian Topp, partner at GT & Company and one-time national campaign director to the NDP leader Jack Layton, and Tonda McCharles, Ottawa bureau chief at the Toronto Star. And it's great to have you two here. You again, you for the first time, Andrew. Glad we could finally get you on. And to our friends out of town, thanks for joining us tonight on TVO. And Tonda, I'm going to put you to work right away. We know the Conservatives are about to put forward this non-confidence motion. We also know it's not going to pass, because the NDP and the Bloc say they're going to support the government. So tell us, what is the value in doing this?
Look, I think it signals to everybody it's a whole new ballgame. This is going to be a roller coaster of a ride for the parliamentary session. The Conservatives are going to put forward this vote, even if they know they might lose it. Well, they will lose it on Wednesday, but they've set down a marker and they've pushed the Bloc and the NDP into corners where they've had to state clearer positions. The Bloc has been the most clear, laying out a series of demands, and the NDP is saying they're going to go on a vote-by-vote basis. But I think now everybody's on their guard. This is a roller coaster of a session.
Brian, same to you. What's the value in doing this?
It's showbiz. I think they're trying to embarrass the other two opposition parties, but I don't think the other two opposition parties want to make Mr. Poilievre Prime Minister of Canada. So basically the Tories are playing their game to their own people, doing what their own people expect them to do. But what we see in this vote is what it would be like if they were the largest party in a future federal election, which is they struggle to work with anybody else.
Ginny, the value of doing this, knowing it's going to fail.
Well, to be embarrassed, you have to feel shame. And I think the Conservatives assumed the NDP and the Bloc would feel a sense of shame at propping up such a deeply unpopular government. And so I think the Conservatives want them to squirm. And they have been squirming, right? You saw Jagmeet Singh obviously felt some squirming because he put on a bit of a show and said he was tearing up his supply and confidence agreement. Ultimately, that meant nothing. He's still going to prop up the government. But I think he felt uncomfortable. Going into those by-elections, he was, I think, a bit freaked out that he was going to be too tied to a very, very unpopular Liberal government that he'd been propping up for years. And so the Conservatives, I think, want to go further down that path and really try to make voters that they're fighting the NDP for, and in many cases winning over, at least if you believe the polling, and make those voters understand what the choice looks like.
Are you squirming, Andrew?
Well, I think, the NDP are in between a rock and a hard place. They had to make this move politically 2.5 years into this agreement. It was clear that it was not benefiting Singh and the NDP politically. What becomes difficult is this is the most progressive iteration of the federal Liberal Party that we've seen ever. And Singh has supported this government strongly for the past 2.5 years. In fact, pharmacare is actually not the law of the land yet. It still has to pass the Senate. And so forever how much longer this government lasts, Singh has to walk a very tight rope around using political rhetoric to attack the Prime Minister and create more political distance between him and the Liberal government, while also being a champion for progressive social policy. And that's a huge challenge.
Brian, I should ask you, do you think it was a good idea for Mr. Singh to end the agreement that he had with the Liberals?
Oh, first of all, with regard to what we were just hearing, I think what Mr. Singh intends to do is say the Liberals are on their way to the repair shop. Clearly, the public is done with them. And the next election is going to be a decision between the New Democrats and the Conservatives. And I think he's going to focus a lot of his fire on the Tories, frankly, which is what Jack Layton always used to say. When you're in a swim race, you don't pay attention to who's behind you. You pay attention to who's in front of you. To your question, look, viewed by New Democrats, they were doing their job. They were doing what they've always done since the 1920s, which is when you get into Parliament and the public has given you a little bit of power, you use it to try to get things done. And we have pensions and employment insurance, and we have the Medicare and many other good things because the NDP played that way. And they made some progress, some incremental good progress in this Parliament, and it mostly got done. And now it's time to focus on the coming election. And I don't think that they want to have to simultaneously be defending the government and outlining why they'd be a better alternative to it. So it was time to part company from this accord. But it wasn't nothing. It was more of what they up to now they've done very well in federal politics for many years, which is parlay balance of power position into some gains for the public, and they got that done.
Tonda, I should just get a word from you on Mr. Singh's both performance and the aftermath of the quote-unquote ripping up of an agreement that I don't think actually exists on paper, so there was nothing to rip up. But anyway, he ended the agreement. Tell us how that played after he did that in that news conference in such dramatic fashion.
Well, I mean, there was an agreement on paper. There were a set of 24 sort of quid pro quos. We'll do this in exchange for your support getting our bills through Parliament. And so there were a series of progressive policies. But to your question about, Singh's performance in all of this, I think that many people have rightly said that when he called an end to the deal, he didn't outline a clear case as to why now. And let's face it, I think Brian's done that, outlined that it's time for them to set some distance between Mr. Singh and Mr. Trudeau and differentiate the parties somehow on the left and the center left. And left, we will say, because Trudeau's never governed more left than when he was aligned with Singh. But Mr. Singh, for all his rhetoric around a corrupt government, all but calling them corrupt, for all his rhetoric around saying why he couldn't work with them, calling the Liberals weak and selfish, he was unable to articulate clear policy reasons why and where they differed and where they will part ways in the future. In fact, as he's admitted since the getting out of the deal, he said they want to see dental care finalized, expanded to all eligible claimants, not just the young and the seniors. They want pharmacare to get through. It's in the Senate right now. So he's made very clear that in many cases, he will support Trudeau. However, I think he's starting to articulate, and maybe this is what we're going to see in the weeks ahead, that more differentiation is coming on, for example, the carbon pricing scheme. We hear they're going to pull back from the consumer price on carbon. So these will be things to watch. How does he differentiate himself? But I don't see it happening very, very soon. And we can talk about that some more.
Ginny, the piece you wrote for The Hub, the headline was, Trudeau duped Singh and Poilievre schooled them both. Okay, I know that's your view, but make the case.
Well, I think you have to give Trudeau some credit for how long he's strung along the NDP. The NDP have claimed to have extracted commitments from Trudeau, but I don't see a lot of evidence of that. It's true the government's left-wing, but the government's left-wing on all kinds of experimental social policies that people seem to not like very much when it comes to crime and public safety. Lots of programs announced, but very few actually rolled out, certainly not making impact for people that they're telling pollsters that they feel and that therefore that they're supportive of. And we sort of have gone through this rigmarole through these confidence of the budget, other items, where Singh has made a big show of extracting more commitments. And I think the Liberals have sort of quietly chuckled as they've convinced the NDP to support them through this period since 2019 where they have not had a majority of seats in the House of Commons and they've been able to govern as though they have. And so I think Trudeau deserves some credit for that brinksmanship. But in the end, by both of them being combined and by having a left-wing, very progressive government, they've gone further down this path of like big government, big spending, high taxes, while the public has said enough. Like, this is not what we want. And as a result, Poilievre appears to be the only choice for a change. So if the public wants a change, less spending, lower taxes, more relief, no carbon tax, they have one choice. And for now, for Jagmeet Singh to try to say, I'm going to bring change is all but impossible. I think that's a really, really steep hill for him to climb, and I don't think he can pull it off.
Do you think, Andrew, that the Liberal government has done anything as a result of needing the NDP support that they wouldn't otherwise have done had they had a majority?
I think there's an argument to be made that the supply and confidence agreement did push the Liberals into a more progressive direction. Perhaps not substantively, but in terms of speed. You know, since earning their third mandate exactly 3 years ago, we've seen remarkable progress. Dental care, which despite what Conservatives say is now operational, 650,000 Canadians are benefiting from that. A model for national pharmacare, which can be expanded upon, which will hopefully become the law of the land shortly. National child care, something that the Liberal Party had been talking about as early as under former leader John Turner. So substantively, no, but the speed in which we've seen this social progress, I will give the NDP credit for that. My question is, I think that they could have extracted all these concessions from the Liberal government without formally partnering up with them. I think they could have, on a piece-by-piece basis, like Jack Layton did. I hearken back 20 years ago, I was a page in the Minority Parliament of Paul Martin, and Jack Layton was masterful in extracting concessions from Paul Martin. And in fact, there was a Liberal NDP budget deal that was done in the spring of 2005. I was there, and millions of dollars flowing for social housing and other progressive social policies. Now,
if I were in a really cheeky mood, I would say, then why did he bring down Martin's government and usher in
a decade
of Stephen Harper? But that's another story for another show. Tonda, let me get to you on this, and that is, if it were a different leader at a different time, maybe with a different party, two absolutely groundbreaking, shocking by-election losses might have caused a volcanic eruption from the party in which it was happening. That doesn't seem to have happened this time. And I wonder if you could tell us why Mr. Trudeau so far seems to have withstood any massive pushback despite losing Toronto St. Paul's, which we sit in right now, and La Salle-et-Mère-Verdun in Quebec. How come?
Look, I think that there was tremendous pushback after the loss in June of Toronto St. Paul's by the so-called 416 Liberal caucus. It was furious at the loss, furious at all kinds of targets, the party machinery, the campaign organizers, the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister himself. And there was an uproar, but it was tamped down in part by the fact that there wasn't a giant national caucus meeting and airing of grievances. And that wasn't so much by design, I'm told, at the PMO. It was actually because of a scheduling of, they were quickly after Toronto St. Paul's, Parliament had broken. There was no national caucus scheduled. He was at NATO, and then on it went. And then they started doing their outreach. So they tamped down some of that dissent. And when it comes to Quebec and the loss in South Montreal of La Salle-et-Mère-Verdun, that's in large part a function of the fact that the Quebec caucus is actually not the 416 caucus. They're very much more united. They have a different dynamic. They don't air their laundry out in public. We were getting lots of people complaining to us privately on background. And so we were able to publish a lot of those concerns, even if it was under, confidential sources. But in the Quebec caucus, they're still pretty tight. There's a lot of grumbling, but nobody's outright calling for the Prime Minister to go. Why is all of that the case? I think it is also a function of the fact that he's persuaded them that he doesn't want to go. And most of them came on his coattails in 2015, or if not in 2015, 2019, or 2021. This is not the party of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, where there were divisions and the ability to control membership and executive directorship at the riding level. The party has changed all its rules. So getting rid of a leader who doesn't want to go is a whole new ball game. And so there's all kinds of steam, the steam valves are open. People are grumbling to Trudeau and his staff behind closed doors, but there's no mechanism by which to oust him.
No, there's no mechanism, but yeah, sure. But let me get Brian to build on that answer as well, because, well, for example, we saw in your party when Tom Mulcair led your party, the NDP, to actually not a terrible election outcome. They threw him overboard really quickly and with extreme prejudice. And here we are, Justin Trudeau has been, losing, and there is no obvious heir apparent, and he seems to be able to quell any of the mutineers. What's the special sauce he's got going for him, you think, that allows him to do that?
Timing. Look, I was at that convention in Edmonton when my friend Mr. Mulcair was sent back into the private sector by the members. And
we should say you
after an
jokingly call
election.
him my friend because you ran against him for the job, and you two did not emerge from that as bosom buddies. But anyway, keep going.
So, it was a postmortem after an election which was viewed as devastating, in a circumstance in which was building on the orange wave. We thought we had a shot at government, and we ended up back in third place, having lost an enormous chunk of that wonderful breakthrough in Quebec, and party members took it very badly. Here we've got a prime minister who's months away from an election. So, changing your leader at this stage of the game when you only have a few months before you're likely to meet the electorate is extremely difficult. And it's not obvious that they've got anybody available who would do better in those circumstances. The calculus becomes, maybe I could win. For them to win, they're going to have to come up with a really good offer, because I think in the alternate, they're facing a change election. The public has made up their mind. And, after 9 or 10 years, that's often what happens to every government. Or in the alternate, what they calculate is that they'll do least bad under the prime minister, and then they're not handing whoever succeeds him a poison chalice, where the successor has to eat a defeat. Instead, the successor can do the rebuild. So you could argue that Mr. Trudeau is either looking for a really big reset, in which case they're going to have to come up with it really soon, or he's doing the honorable thing and eating what's coming, so his successor doesn't have to.
Andrew, let me set up the question to you with a few more facts, and that is, it's not just the 2 by-election losses. It's the campaign director saying, I'm standing down because I'm not sure I can orchestrate a victory for you next time around. It's his Quebec lieutenant, Pablo Rodriguez, leading the National Caucus to go run for the Quebec Liberal leadership. What exactly is putting wind in Liberal sails these days?
Well, it's a good question, Steve. Very little. I've been involved in this party for 20 years. It's been a big part of my life and my professional life. And it's been very painful over the past 6 months to watch the series of events that have happened, particularly coming out of Toronto St. Paul's. It was summer, but we heard very little from the Prime Minister. No change in policies, no change in communications approach. There was no cabinet shuffle, no staff changes. The only real announcement was a couple weeks ago when they announced Mark Carney would be a senior economic advisor, which I give them credit for.
To the caucus.
To the caucus.
Not the government, but the caucus.
Yes, and I think that was largely a positive story. But I want to pick up on a point that Brian made. I think conventional wisdom is that perhaps no other new leader could do better than Trudeau. I want to challenge that thesis. Time is indeed running out, and the end of the supply and confidence agreement does make the situation of this government more complicated and more inherently unstable. But if we look down south, what happened with Joe Biden doing the right thing and Kamala Harris ascending to the leadership of the Democratic Party, that has been a fundraising boon. It's re-energized the base of the Democratic Party and single-handedly changed the trajectory of an election. And I just want to say, yes, there is no mechanism, but I guess the challenge we have is there doesn't appear to be a Canadian Nancy Pelosi, or for that matter, a Canadian Kamala Harris. But I think perhaps a robust leadership race held very soon could duke that out, and I think we could do better with a new leader.
I'll push back a little bit on that, only in as much as you don't have to look south for an example of that. Your party did it. They kicked out Patrick Brown in January of 2018. Doug Ford became the leader in March of 2018, and he was premier in June of 2018. Sure. I mean, stuff happens fast up here, too. As you watch the Liberals do whatever it is that they're in the midst of right now, how do Conservatives have to be careful that they don't overplay their hand right now?
They've got a pretty strong hand. And I think the discipline has to be, what is the issue set that is resonating with voters? So I won't repeat the slogan, or maybe I will. Axe the tax, fix the budget, stop the crime, build the homes. But I only say it to say that is the discipline of that caucus, right? You saw Pierre Poilievre address his caucus when Parliament came back. There was axe the tax written as far as the eye could see. It was drilled in the speech. And that's where you see the discipline.
Axe the tax and replace it with what?
Well, I don't know that you have to replace. I think most voters right now want less tax, not more. So they wouldn't want to replace it with anything. So they want their taxes to be lower.
And forget the rebate as well, I guess, eh?
Well, I think that on balance, voters have said we don't want it. And so, yeah, repealing the carbon tax, crystal clear. I think you can expect that to be the first act of a new parliament under Prime Minister Poilievre if that happens. But I think the discipline comes in on the message discipline and the issue set. As far as Parliament goes and these sort of hijinks, I think he's got to keep the pressure really, really solidly on those other parties so that they don't have any room to try to sort of hoodwink Canadians into thinking that somehow they will bring change. I mean, Jagmeet Singh's been very clear that he won't. I'm not interested in changing things up. He's shown that over the last number of months. And so he's got a pretty open lane. The challenge for the Conservatives now is they have to somehow get through the next year. And I think it'll be a long time because I think the other parties don't want to call an election. They don't want to see Poilievre win. And by all accounts, he would.
Tonda, let me go to you on that because Ginny says it's obvious the Prime Minister doesn't want to change his policy as it relates to the carbon tax. The NDP has decided to make a change in their view of supporting the carbon tax. Do you think it's a given that there will be no changes at all to that policy over the next 13 months before the election?
I wouldn't rule anything out at this stage because the Liberals are famously agile and nimble when it comes to stealing other people's great ideas. And look, if there's a way to maybe tweak a consumer carbon levy of the fuel charge that consumers pay in terms of maybe ratcheting back the scheduled increases or something. I wouldn't rule out because, look, Mr. Trudeau is very set on fighting the Conservatives back. And this is this whole cost of living piece is something they're acutely tuned into. They also know that if they did something like that, maybe they could gain still support from the from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. So even though they would keep a price in place, maybe they'd tweak it a little bit and say it's applying nationwide and avoid the political fallout they had when they did a different carve out for home heating fuel and really played it as a political play in Atlantic Canada. That was their mistake. So I wouldn't rule things out. I think that this government is fighting for its life right now and fighting to stay and carry through. This leader's fighting to stay and carry through the next campaign. So, anyone who thinks they know exactly what's going on in Justin Trudeau's mind right now, I think is kidding you.
Brian, I should get you on that because it's not only the federal NDP that has distanced itself from the current carbon tax and rebate policy. Bonnie Crombie, the leader of the Ontario Liberals, has also said she's not for it either. Will not be bringing in anything comparable if she were to become premier after the next Ontario election. Is that the reality of politics in Canada today, that this thing's a dead skunk and it just ain't gonna... How do I finish off this sentence? So
Walk across the road.
There we go. Okay. Over to you, Brian.
Well, look, carbon pricing is conservative policy. It's saying that it was introduced by a conservative government in British Columbia on the idea that you should tax things you don't like and then use the money to, in the case of that government, to stop taxing things you do like, which is people's income. That was the deal in British Columbia. And when our government in Alberta, I was Rachel Notley's chief of staff when we did this, mirrored British Columbia's policy, what we were telling ourselves is we're going to adopt a conservative approach, which is a conservative economist approach of carbon pricing, in order to try to get consensus on the climate change issue and stop debating it, because climate change is urgent and we need to deal with it. And then what we were up to was revenues would get recycled into Alberta to fund renewables and change and lower carbon emissions from the oil and gas sector. So what's happened is the people who you would expect would support conservative policy, which is the Conservatives, have instead decided to run a populist campaign. And by the way, this slogan, "Axe the Tax," was first road tested by the NDP in British Columbia, opposing the Conservatives on this issue. And what they discovered was at the end of the day, when the public thinks about it, they wanted to act on climate change. And they thought that climate change deniers weren't setting out a responsible position. So look, Social Democrats, left to their own devices, don't use market-based carbon pricing to deal with issues like this. Cap and trade thing where there's a hard cap, or regulatory solutions are more in our wheelhouse. And so if the Conservatives themselves are repudiating their own policies to embrace a cheap populism, which your guest there couldn't defend for 10 seconds because you asked the immediate question, which is what about the rebate? And by the way, what about the industrial carbon pricing and all the other issues that fall out of it, which Mr. Poilievre was refusing to answer, then we don't have to embrace it either. And at the end of the day, you get back to if we don't have consensus on this, then you can advance your own solutions. The consumer carbon price deals with about 8% of Canada's emissions. It's not critical. And if at the end of the day there isn't consensus on it, then people like us will advocate measures that we think are effective, which are directly at it with a cap.
Ginny's champing at the bit to get in here. Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's pretty cynical, that the NDP are now running as fast as they can away from this very, very unpopular policy. And I think the reason it's unpopular, and voters, by the way, there's nothing wrong with populism. Voters are not dumb. They can experience a policy and decide they don't like it. And the reason they don't like the carbon tax is because for it to work, it has to go up to the point of being punitive. And we live in a cold country. So people have to heat their homes. They have to drive to work. All the ways that they experience the consumer carbon tax as prices have gone up, as inflation's out of control because of NDP propped up government spending, totally run away, has made it so that they're broke, they're poor, and they can't afford to heat their homes or fill their cars. And they said to politicians, enough. And now every politician is running away from it as fast as they could, even the ones who defended it to the end, by saying that if you believe in climate change, you have to do what it takes to stop it. And pricing carbon is the only way. Well, it turns out that's not true, because carbon doesn't respect borders. It doesn't care that Canada is a nation state. And instead of exploiting our natural resources, getting natural gas to tidewater, replacing, Chinese coal and much dirtier forms of emissions around the world, we've been navel gazing so that we can look good at Davos. I mean, it's absurd. And it's hilarious now for left of center parties to pretend that they never supported it. I think voters want a different alternative, clearly. That's why you see the change.
Let me show you some numbers here,
Please.
which might just buttress what you were about to say. Sheldon, can you bring up this graphic, please? Ipsos polling, who Canadians want as their next prime minister. Here we go. This won't surprise you. You've been following Canadian politics. Pierre Poilievre remains the top pick for PM among Canadians at 45%. Justin Trudeau, the current prime minister, is a distant second at 26%. 25% think Jagmeet Singh would make the best prime minister. Tonda, let me go to you first on this, and then I'm going to come back to Jenny. We have a bit of an unusual situation in the country right now, because normally it is, I guess, the job of the Fourth Estate, members of the media, to keep the prime minister of the day accountable. But Pierre Poilievre is telling everybody he's the prime minister in waiting. The polls suggest it. It's only a matter of time. So my question is it incumbent upon you and your colleagues in Ottawa to stop treating him like an opposition leader and more like the PM in waiting he is, and force him to be more accountable on everything? What do you think?
Well, there is a shot at the gallery, but look, I think come any day up to the Hill to see how reporters do try to do that, to hold Mr. Poilievre accountable, to ask him for specifics on all his policies. Most days, that's impossible because, first of all, he doesn't take questions very often, and when he does, it's a 4 to 8 minute speech in French, then in English, and then it's 2 questions, and he does his talking points and turns on his heel. So don't think the questions aren't being asked. But to Jenny's point, this is a very disciplined political communicator. He has honed it to a skill. He does it. He's not afraid of looking rude to anybody. He has no governor in that respect. And so if people watch live, you will see people trying to hold him to account. And I don't think that will stop from here to the next campaign and beyond. But is it incumbent on Mr. Poilievre to answer some of these questions? The Conservatives will tell you they don't feel the need to be detailed on policy specifics now because it's well ahead of an election, that there will be details coming in a campaign. But that won't stop people from asking. And I think that then it's up to Canadians to judge if that's the kind of political accountability that they're prepared to endorse. In fact, I think the appetite, to all the panelists' point, the appetite out there is for change. Can Mr. Poilievre between now and then make mistakes? Yes, he can. He can make mistakes in the way he communicates to Canadians, coming off looking as a very aggressive opposition leader and not prime ministerial. Is that a mistake Canadians are willing to tolerate now in order to get rid of Trudeau? Who knows? But those polls tell me that people are a lot more tolerant right now because the change idea is the one that's in the forefront. They're not looking to Mr. Poilievre for, sunny ways and hope and all of those other narratives that often go with campaigns. They're looking for change.
Okay, two things. First of all, I feel your pain because he came to Mississauga to do an event. I waited in line to ask a question. I got one question, no supplementary. I wonder, what's he worried about? He's good. I mean, he's got game. He doesn't have to worry about supplementaries. That's number one. Number two.
No. You're making the same mistake that everybody made in the Harper years. It's never about what they're worried about. Mr. Poilievre is perfectly capable of handling any question. Any of us throw at him. It's a question of what he wants to control the message of the day to be, and the question of what he wants to be in the papers and on the newscasts, if he even cares about that, because he has his own channels to communicate with voters via social media and via other targeted media outreach. But, he's not looking to the mainstream broadcasters or news outlets to do that.
Yes. Now, let me follow up on the second part of your question, which is, Ginny, to say, yes, more Canadians, the biggest chunk of Canadians like him as PM more than any other candidate. However, I remember not too long ago talking to a Conservative partisan who said, I like him, but does he have to act like such an objectionable, and then the next word rhymed with trick, all the time? What's the answer to that? Can he not bevel his edges and act a little more prime ministerial?
How old was that partisan?
Older than me.
Yeah. He's really particularly popular among young people, and I think there's a stylistic piece there, which is to say, first of all, he wants to bring change, and I think the change is substantive. So it's true, he's not able to platform, he hasn't costed every commitment, but I worked on his leadership campaign, and we rolled out a lot of policy planks, and he talks about policy on a really regular basis because he wants people to understand how he's going to fix inflation, how he's going to get housing built, how he's going to lower taxes.
Inflation's pretty much fixed, isn't it?
Yeah, but he cares about a fiscal policy and a monetary policy that will keep it in line, which this current government has not. So all this to say, I think there's substance behind all of this, which is why he's become popular and become popular with young people. And a lot of people take umbrage with his merely being popular or his being a strong communicator. Just because he communicates well or he thinks he comes up with slogans to describe his policies doesn't mean they're devoid of policy.
It's not those slogans people object to. I think it's when he says things like "sell out, sing." That's name calling. That's like schoolyard Donald Trump name calling. Why does he indulge in that?
I think it's branding. He's branding for the public that this Jagmeet Singh, who they might not be that familiar with, has been the guy who's been selling out and propping up a government that ostensibly has policies he doesn't support for years. And he wants the public to understand that so that they make take that decision at the ballot box.
Andrew.
Mr. Poilievre is a very talented political communicator. I don't question that for a moment. But his pithy sound bites are only that. This is an individual who's been in Parliament for 20 years. He is very much part of the establishment. And so this narrative that he's an outsider and he's going to come in and revolutionize Ottawa is nonsense in my view. And this is someone that's well outside the mainstream of Canada, of both where Liberal and Conservative parties have traditionally governed. Someone that has promised to defund the CBC, English Canada CBC. Mind you, he doesn't talk about Radio-Canada because he knows that's popular in Quebec. And there is no platform, and I suspect there will be no platform until even in the election, there'll probably be 5 key points, and that's about it. And so I think it really concerns me as a Canadian, and I think it accelerates and really underlines why the Liberal Party needs genuine reform, because we are facing a populist conservative. And, I think replacing Mr. Trudeau is a necessary but not sufficient condition for reform. This is a party that, I was attracted to the party because 20 years ago, because it was a brokerage party that brokered interest in Western Canada and English Canada,
it's not
Quebec.
Anymore.
It was also a party that married free market economy.
I got to save some time for Brian. I'm down to my last 30 seconds, Brian. What are your plans for the guy who says he's the Prime Minister in waiting?
Well, he's going to be called out. This is a guy who wants to get elected as Prime Minister by chanting angry nursery rhymes and hinting at policies that don't hold up to a hill of beans. What he has to say about inflation is he wants deep, unspecified cutbacks to the federal government. What are those? And he's a guy who says, we're going to fix housing by beating up municipal mayors. How? And to what end? And so I think, the angry nursery rhymes have been working for him up to now. People are in the mood for change. That's the mood that they're in. There's no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, I think in the run up to the election, he's going to be called out, and people will look for something better. And although those are good numbers to show, the last thing to say, a majority of Canadians don't want this man to be prime minister. So the question is, who's the alternative? And in a time for a change election, it's going to be up to Mr. Singh to offer a better alternative. We'll see if he does offer it.
Let the story unfold, and I want to thank the four of you for coming on to TVO tonight to discuss it. Brian Topp, Tonda McCharles, Ginny Roth, Andrew Perez. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Artificial intelligence is fast becoming a part of our daily lives, showing up in places we would never have expected, including at border crossings around the world. With more people fleeing their countries due to war, climate change, and other destabilizing events, our next guest argues that countries are turning to AI-driven technology to help secure their borders, but at a profound human cost. Joining us now, Petra Molnar, author of The Walls Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And Petra, it's great to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
As people are going to discover, you have just the smallest hint of an accent. Now, I know you separate your time between Toronto and New York right now, but your background is really interesting. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, like so many people in Canada, I have my own migration story that brought me here, first as a teenager to Winnipeg, and then to Toronto. But yeah, my family is split between different continents, and I think that's probably what motivated me to do this work.
Where did your life start?
In the Czech Republic.
Czech Republic, as it then was and still is.
In Czechoslovakia, actually. Maybe
Well,
I'm dating myself.
you're not old enough to be, are you? No, you're not old enough to be in Czechoslovakia.
I am.
I guess you are.
I am.
Okay.
It's good makeup.
Live and learn. Let's do an excerpt from the book, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would. Here's Petra Molnar in her book. Technology is often presented as being neutral, but it is always socially constructed. All technologies have an inherently political dimension, whether it be, for instance, about who counts and why, and they replicate biases that render certain communities at risk of being harmed. Consequently, what we are really talking about when we talk about borders is a human laboratory of high-risk experiments. Okay, lots to unpack here, Petra. A human laboratory of high-risk experiments. What does that mean?
So it means that a lot of governments around the world are using new technologies, things like drones, surveillance, AI-type projects to augment the way that migration control is happening. But borders have historically been these spaces where there's not a lot of oversight or accountability. A lot of decisions get made behind closed doors. And it creates this kind of high-risk experimentation where technologies are tested out without even public knowledge.
These drones and sensors and cameras or so on, are they inherently nefarious?
Well, it depends how you look at it, right? Because I think technology is a social construct. It's something that replicates vast power differentials that we have in our world, and it's definitely not a neutral tool. So the way that it's being used right now, unfortunately, is kind of exacerbating the way that it's harming people who are crossing borders.
Okay, let's look at the most famous border in the world anyway right now, and that's the U.S.-Mexico border, where it's either under control or there's an invasion every day, depending on which presidential candidate you want to listen to. What does the technology testing on that border look like right now?
So the U.S.-Mexico border is a really interesting place where you can actually go and see some of this technology, and the book took me there. I've been in Arizona many times trying to understand what's happening there, and you can see, for example, AI-type towers that have been erected in the Sonora Desert to sweep the desert and create this kind of surveillance dragnet. There's also robo-dogs that were announced a couple of years ago by the Department of Homeland Security to augment the way that borders are being policed.
So when we hear we got to build a wall, we got to build a wall, there's a lot more than just a wall happening there.
Absolutely. It's really a smart wall and a smart border system that has expanded the border from its kind of physical location into the skies and across the land, and has really created, again, this kind of laboratory of experimentation with tech that you wouldn't see in other spaces.
I think we get just by definition what a robo-dog is, but do you want to just put a little more flesh on that bone, no pun intended?
Sure. I mean, it's one of those, I think, most draconian examples that I've come across. It's essentially a four-legged military-grade piece of technology that you might have actually come across on a sci-fi show like The Black Mirror or other types of movies that are futuristic, but it's really not the future. It's here.
Now, for as long as I can recall, the U.S.-Canada border has always been described as the longest undefended border in the world. What's going on that border?
So the Canada-US border is another site where technology has been tested out for a number of years. And that's actually where my work in this started. Back in 2018, we came across some documents that proved that the Canadian government was using AI and different types of technologies to augment our immigration decision-making system too.
Like what?
Like visa triaging algorithms, for example.
English, please. What does that mean?
So an algorithm is basically like a recipe of programmable steps. So it's something that helps you make decisions and augment the way that human decisions are made. And so you feed it a bunch of information and it comes out with a result. And so essentially what the Canadian government has been doing is using machine learning and algorithms to automate the way that visas are given out.
On this issue of the U.S.-Canada border, DNA collection pilot projects. What's going on?
So that's kind of one of the, again, latest manifestations of how much this space is expanding. DNA collection was tested out at the Canada-US border and also at the US-Mexico border, including on minors in that situation. And again, it's almost like your body becoming your passport in that instance.
Do you know when I drive to Buffalo to go to a Sabres game and I don't actually get to the booth where the person is, but the car stops before that, and there's clearly something taking my picture, looking at me, surveying me. I don't know what it's doing. What's it doing, and where's that picture going?
That's a great question, and I think that's part of the story too. We just oftentimes don't know what kind of technology is being used, what data is being collected, and whether we can actually meaningfully opt out. It's similar stuff that we see in airports, for example, right? With facial recognition being used, or just even other types of technology that's made its way into migration.
Yeah, there's a suspicion, well, maybe this is my inference, but when you go to the airport, you kind of expect everything, anything, it's all hands on deck. The border, at least, I remember the days of my childhood when going to the border it was like almost Ontario to Quebec. There was nothing to it. There's a lot more to it now, isn't there? Do I need to be worried about that?
Well, borders have been changing and they've become sharper, I would say, in the last number of decades, really. And technology plays that up, right? Like we are seeing more infrastructure, more technology, more kind of projects that are being tested out, oftentimes, again, without our knowledge. And you might end up at a border and not even know kind of what you're interacting with.
And even you, with all the research you've done, you're not sure where all that information goes?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the story. I mean, I do this for a living, and I've sent out so many access to information requests to different governments. I've been to different conferences. I have closed-door meetings with officials, and often it's very difficult to get a full picture of just how much technology there really is and how it's harming people.
I've seen your CV. You have been everywhere. How many countries do you think you visited?
Quite a few. I mean, for this book, at least 6 or 7.
Oh, no, but you've done speaking engagements, your research takes you all over the place. You've been to lots and lots of countries. Can you tell us which border in the world between which two countries you think right now is the most concerning as it relates to these issues?
It's hard to pick one, but I would probably have to say the US-Mexico border because, of course, it's also an election issue in this year, and it's becoming a political free-for-all, so to speak, and it's definitely a border to watch.
We're going to talk some U.S. politics, okay?
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Republicans, of course, have been very strong in their view on border security, finishing the border wall, increasing deportations, that kind of thing. Many people in the Democratic Party, conversely, are for softer immigration policies, so-called, more pathways to citizenship, better treatment for undocumented immigrants, that kind of thing. So a Harris presidency versus a Trump presidency presumably makes a big difference in your line of work, fair to say?
Yes and no. I think at first blush, definitely a Harris presidency may not be, again, as sharp on migration as another Trump administration. But the Democrats have also been expanding a lot of problematic policymaking, especially on the smart border side of things. So I think we need to keep a careful eye on what their policy actually is going to be if there is to be a Harris administration.
To the best of my knowledge, the president who expelled more people in my lifetime was Barack Obama.
Exactly, yeah. Sometimes known as deporter-in-chief.
Deporter-in-chief. So for those people who think Trump is the biggest problem going here, maybe not?
I think it's the politics of migration. That's the biggest problem.
How did Biden do? Joseph Biden, the current president, how has he done following up on what Donald Trump started?
I mean, there has definitely been kind of a return, somewhat at least, to a human rights respecting framework, but there's also been very problematic expansions of the surveillance state, of the border industrial complex in that situation, and again, deportations again also.
So the military-industrial complex, in your line of thinking, is not the biggest problem we have nowadays, eh?
I think it's the military and the border industrial complex. They're actually together.
The bigger concern, in your view, the technology deployed at the borders or the lack of oversight deploying those technologies at the borders?
I'll give you a bit of a lawyerly answer. I think it's both. I do actually think there's some technology that is concerning. Things like robodogs or AI lie detectors. Those are things that I think we should just not be using. There needs to be a red line under. But a lot of it is about the governance, or lack thereof. We just don't really have a lot of law or policy making that would put some guardrails around this.
What technology are you okay with?
I think technology that ultimately would help kind of rebalance the power differentials that are inherent in immigration, you know, and maybe make the system more transparent and fair and make access to resources better for people.
Are lie detectors okay?
No, definitely not.
Because?
Well, I mean, lie detectors as a technology, the kind of traditional ones, you know, the ones that go back and forth that you might see on CSI, they're really problematic and they don't even work properly. Now there's experimentation with AI-type lie detectors in the European Union, for example, using facial recognition to make inferences about people's behavior and say, oh, this person is likely a liar or not. This is happening and being researched.
Let me be provocative just for the heck of it, okay? Sure. It wasn't that long ago that we saw somebody who was in Quebec trying to get into New York State to make trouble, to perform a terrorist act in New York State. If that person could have been polygraphed before anything more dramatic happened, would that not be worth doing?
Well, I guess it ultimately goes back to what the polygraphs are even doing, because this AI-type project that I mentioned, I mean, it's been basically debunked as snake oil. It doesn't even work the way it's intended to. And I understand, of course, there are real security concerns that come with certain people and certain borders, but the answer isn't untested, unregulated, and high-risk technology that can then also be used to harm others.
There are biases associated with AI. We have heard them, particularly as it relates to people of color. You want to expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. I mean, AI in particular has a really poor track record when it comes to discrimination, particularly along racial lines. I mean, we know that facial recognition is very biased against people with darker skin, for example. Not to mention some of these more kind of nuanced ways that bias can be baked into it if we're using biased data sets to make decisions.
If they're smart enough to figure out how to do face recognition AI, how can they not be smart enough to take the racism out of it?
Well, maybe that's the question to ask, right?
I just did.
I guess that's really what it's about. Is that a goal, or is it really about automating certain processes to make certain goals easier?
On the other hand, I can also imagine people saying, we saw all sorts of headlines about how inhumane the wall at, for example, U.S.-Mexico could be. Kids taken away from their parents, put in cages, separated for weeks, if not months at a time. That's pretty scary stuff. If you can come up with technology that would obviate the need for any of that, to the extent that there is any need at all, wouldn't you rather go that route?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, right? But again, we are in a world that is kind of built on power differentials. And also in immigration, there's so much discretion that goes into the way that decisions get made. And so for sure, I mean, if we are working towards a world that is more fair and more transparent, then technology can help with that. But what it's doing now is it's just exacerbating the kind of wall that you're describing. It's just a digital wall now.
So what kind of ethical considerations that are not currently being undertaken should we be thinking about?
Well, I mean, ethics are definitely part of it. You know, we need to think about what this is doing to real humans, and especially people who are marginalized and people who have been historically disenfranchised from these conversations. But I actually think ethics don't go far enough. We actually need to have conversations about human rights, about regulation, and about some no-go zones. I don't think it's ever appropriate to introduce a robo-dog at the border or use predictive policing, for example, or even welfare algorithms, things like this that are being developed without public scrutiny.
Predictive policing is very Minority Report, isn't it?
It
Remember
is.
that Tom Cruise movie? Of course you do. Yeah. You have a problem with that.
For sure, because again, it's about who gets to make decisions about which groups of people. And if we're moving into prediction, I mean, that can get out of hand incredibly quickly.
During COVID, we got, I think we probably got accustomed to having our civil rights curtailed for what we were told was the greater good, namely the health of society. Have we therefore, to some extent, normalized a lot of what we're talking about here today to the point where we're not as vigilant or concerned about it maybe as we should be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the COVID moment did normalize surveillance and certain incursions when it comes to, for example, personal data being shared. And, there's colleagues of mine who have been tracking the kind of trends that have kind of arisen during COVID and have stayed with us. And definitely, I think these moments of crisis do normalize surveillance.
When you fly, or I guess not now, but when you flew from New York to Toronto, for example, during COVID, when it was at its worst, did you use the ArriveCan app?
Yeah, I definitely used it.
What did you think about that?
Well, it's one of those apps that came up as a result of a crisis, right? Where I think there really wasn't an option not to use it. But it reminded me, again, of all these kind of themes and trends that I've been seeing around the world. The fact that a lot of these tools and apps are kind of presented as a solution without even having a conversation about it and what it's doing or whether it's even working.
Never mind that it was a $60 million boondoggle for something that probably could have been done for $2 or $3 million. Did you think the point of it was something worth doing?
Well, it's important to situate it, I think, in the historical moment of COVID, which was a major global health emergency. But I think in retrospect, right, seeing the costs and seeing also the kind of inefficiencies and also the lack of uptake, right, I think shows that perhaps it wasn't the best way forward.
You don't still use it, do you?
No.
Nobody uses it anymore. Do they?
Yeah, I don't think so.
It's still on my phone.
Yeah. I see signs for it at the airport,
Yeah.
but I haven't used it.
I don't know anybody who uses it anymore. Okay, border security as a business, how lucrative?
Very lucrative. I mean, we're talking in the figure of about $70 billion.
Worldwide?
And this is kind of a border industrial complex that has grown up around the use of this technology.
We want to be safe these days, Petra, right? We had a lot of fearful people who want to be safe and who want to think that somebody out there is looking out for their interests. Is that an understandable feeling?
Of course, and I think, given the kind of competing crises that people are dealing with these days, also in the aftermath of COVID and economically and environmentally, there is a lot to think about. But I think decisions motivated by fear are never really the way to go.
No, but that's how you get people motivated, right? I mean, that's what a lot of politics is about, scaring people into allowing governments to do various things that they otherwise couldn't do. But are you prepared to throw the baby out with the bathwater?
I mean, I think ultimately it's about looking at what the effects of these technologies actually are, right? And even if they're motivated by fear, we have to keep coming back to what is this really doing on the ground? And the thing is, it also doesn't just stay at the border, right? The robo-dogs that we were talking about, a year after they were announced by Department of Homeland Security, the New York City Police Department announced they're going to be using them on the streets of New York.
Starting when?
That's to be determined. But some of them have walked around. One was even painted white with black spots on it, like a Dalmatian.
Just to look kind of cute, eh?
Yeah, I guess so. To normalize it again.
Presumably there is a trick to finding the sweet spot between legitimate security concerns and balancing the ethical worries that you have. Are we any good at finding that sweet spot?
It's a hard one to find because so many of the conversations that happen behind closed doors, right? It's government officials, often the private sector, that stands to make a lot of money in the development of this, this border industrial complex. And a lot of people who have training in human rights law or even affected communities are actually not really part of the conversation. I think we need to broaden that out and actually build a bigger table around which we can all sit to have these nuanced points discussed.
Who should be sitting at that table?
I think affected communities, definitely. People who cross borders, people who move. In other contexts, other groups that are kind of on the sharpest edges of technological interventions. That's a major population that's missing from the conversation.
I am trying to imagine you as you are a frequent flyer, right? You travel a lot and you go to a lot of airports, you see a lot of this kind of security. And I do wonder whether are you the kind of person who's a nightmare at the border, who when they ask you for some information, you say, you don't need to know that. You have no business asking me that. Are you that person?
Well, I try to not, be unpleasant, but I think as a lawyer, I do know my rights and I know how difficult it can be at the border, definitely.
Okay, well, tell me how that goes. Like, give me an example of an ask that a border official would have made of you and how you responded if you didn't think that they were on solid ground.
Oh, I remember this one time they were asking me a lot about the work that I did. And I think I was feeling particularly maybe sharp that day. And I said, I work on immigration and refugee issues. And then somehow we got into a bit of a political debate, which could have gone on for another 20 minutes, half an hour. But, we decided to just leave it there. And I was allowed to enter.
Enter which country?
Canada.
Enter Canada. So you got the third degree entering Canada.
Yeah.
Even though you're a Canadian citizen.
Yeah.
What'd you think of that?
Well, I think this is a common experience for many people, many Canadians also, based on your background, based on your travel history. Lots of very problematic decisions can get made at the border under the guise of security again.
I want more on this. How much did you push back?
I pushed back quite a lot, yeah, because, I was coming home, I think, from a conference on human rights, or something like that. And it just felt a little bit of an unnecessary kind of sharp interaction,
That person that you had the argument with, they're under no obligation to let you into the country, right? Or they certainly could have put you aside and subjected you to all kinds of extra security concerns. Were you not worried they would do that to you if you pushed back too much?
No, not at all, because I know my rights and I know my travel history, and because of my work, I think I know how to defend myself. But not everybody can, right? And to me, these reminders are always there to, I guess, highlight again how difficult it can be for people to be interacting with these kind of operations of the border.
Let's say the title of the book again, shall we? The Walls Have Eyes. Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Petra Molnar, thanks for coming into TVO tonight and visiting us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that is the agenda for Monday, September 23rd, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, we look at the effect of Meta's news ban in Canada more than 1 year later. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.